Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Sean McMahon and I have returned with, as you can tell by the title of the video and the thumbnail, another book review. This was the book that I read for the month of February, and yes, this review is getting out a little bit late, had some things pop up, but today I bring you my personal review of The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. To start off, I think the way that we're going to start doing these reviews is dividing up into three sections that I always kind of rank internally in my brain just for fun whenever I'm reading, because as someone who calls themselves a writer myself, it's how I categorize stuff just to keep my brain organized, and that's the world and the world building, the characters, and then finally the story and the plot. So we'll go through three sections for this review, and there'll be an average at the end to see what the overall review is. To start us off, we're going to look at the world building. Unique and standout regions, kingdoms and dynasties, and intriguing hidden gems sprinkled throughout all build upon each other to create a fleshed out and gorgeous world. Simple, effective, and memorable. Not to mention the actual writing lends itself to this type of fantasy, and recently there's a clear feel in modern sci-fi and fantasy of just a more casual approach to the prose and the way it is written. That's not a critique of modern sci-fi and fantasy. It just definitely feels like a more updated, a more modern vocabulary is used. But for The Priory of the Orange Tree, Samantha Shannon kind of steps back a little bit to a lot of the, how older sci-fi and fantasy was written, more lyrical language, something that feels like it would be told theatrically beside a campfire with a lot of embellishment and fancy words to just bring the story along. And it's written, it feels like, with just a massive amount of respect and dignity for the story, and it really helps build you into the world yourself. It feels like you are part of this world, part of this legend as you are reading it, and that's how all those good campfire stories go. Like, look, a campfire horror story doesn't work unless you actually think you're about to get got by the ghost. So it works great, it's wonderful. And overall, from these these awesome highs and lows, the fantastic descriptions, they are quite simple and effective for all of these places, but again, they are evocative, and Samantha Shannon does a great job of creating these intriguing, interesting places in the world that have unique effects. And I mean, for example, the place where the bad guys are is filled with lava, and there's ash in the air, and plague and illness, and it's like, yeah, this is the place where the bad guys are, but it feels like it. And I feel like there's a lot of, again, kind of in modern stories, that you want to kind of have the covers pulled over people's eyes. You want to be able to surprise people with where the bad guys are. Who's really the bad guy? There's not really much of that in this book. It is very clear, hey, these are the bad guys, these are the good guys, and so much of that takes place in the world. The place where the bad guys are looks real scary. The place where the good guys are is definitely a lot better. It's not great. There's still consequences for kind of what rich royal people do in that part of the world, but there's a very stark difference. It's very clear. Samantha Shannon does it with the simple tools of world building, and it's effective, and I love it to death. Overall, the world building for this book is a 10 out of 10. The Priory of the Orange Tree comes from the POV of four main characters, each acting as a lens through which we can see different parts of the world. While Durian, one of these four POV characters, is most certainly what I would call the main protagonist, we also have other POV characters, Artaloth Beck, Nicholas Roos, and of course Tane, all bring refreshing moments to the page. Love those characters or hate them, as they all have their own little quirks and own purposes in the story that are well served. My personal favorite, it was of course Artaloth Beck. He is just like, there's a lot of grandstanding in this novel. There's a lot of epicness and people who come from intense training or special bloodlines and stuff. It's high fantasy, that's how it goes. Artaloth Beck is just kind of your dude. He has, he's a knight, he is in the service of, of the crown and whatnot, but at the end of the day, he is just a man. He has no destiny attached to him, and it is really fun to see his story play. And while Artaloth suffers a lot, and I mean a lot, this man goes through it. He never falters. He never loses his faith in his friends and his family, the ones that he is working to protect, and he's just a very lovable character. She also does a great job of using the non-POV characters to flesh out the story more, create tension, and give us reasons to cheer for or against our main characters. Sabran Brethnet, I think I'm saying that right. I think there's a pronunciation guide in the back. Again, this is a unit of a book, but I never read the pronunciation guides, which I probably should. But Sabran, she is the queen. She is the queen that Ede is sent to guard and protect, and she is as much a protagonist in many cases as Ede is, even more so than some of our other POV characters, and she takes command of the story whenever she is, a main focus of the chapter. She is absolutely, even though she is a side character, a non-POV character. I say side character because I mean non-POV character, but she truly is a main character, and she is intense, easily one of my favorite characters in this book, especially with the connection that she has with Ede and how that develops throughout the story. It is one of the things, the connection between Sabran and Ede is perhaps the number one thing that kept me reading through this book. And that's not to say that this book was boring by any means. When I say kept me reading through this book, I mean it was the middle of February. I was halfway through the book. I was on track to finish this by the end of the month, and then I just had to keep reading all the way through until 3 a.m, because seeing these characters grow and develop together and seeing how they would end up at the end of all of it was just too much to keep me waiting. Characters as well are a 10 out of 10. As you either love, as I said before, hate, or have some opinion on all of them, even those that show up in the last third of the book by the end of it. And Samantha Shannon does a great job of making you feel good about all of those opinions that you would have. So again, characters, 10 out of 10. Now, as much as I've gushed about the world building and the characters, the story itself was also successful. If not, well, I don't want to say disappointing, but I think simple is the best way to explain. Now, again, I don't want this to be like the characters in the world were great and then the plot sucked. That's certainly not what it is, right? Again, it was a very simple plot. Priory of the Orange Tree is, at its heart in terms of the plot, a retelling of 2 classic fantasy stories, Sword in the Stone and kind of the Unsealed Demons, where they were sealed away 1,000 years ago and the seal is weakening and it has to be sealed once again. And then, of course, the classic Sword in the Stone, King Arthur tale. Again, 2 very, very old, kind of fictional tropes, right, that we know today, we sometimes love today, and sometimes we're like, okay, we've heard this quite a lot. Shannon tackles both of these quite well, right, making the well-used narratives very much her own, and that comes from the characters in the world that she has created. That said, the build-up in this very large book was long, right? It was exhilarating. It was so fun to get all the way up to this point, right? I actually think I opened it to the chapter. Yeah, maybe like a little bit past this, right? Like even up to this point, I was having so much fun, right? Constantly so much fun. And there were things that I was expecting this ending to have, or at least not necessarily expecting, but really, really hoping for this ending to have, to just make it so exciting, for all of that build up to culminate into just an epic and awesome moment. And I will say this, it definitely did. The moment was epic. There were huge things happening. There were some crazy things happening. Unfortunately for me, it just kind of felt like, well, it felt sometimes like the easy way out was taken. A very simple path forward was taken with that very last part of the book. And I don't think that is an incorrect thing, right? Samantha Shannon, at the end of the day, made a choice on how the book would end. And that is not a bad thing. There are multiple correct choices. There are multiple good ways to end a story. And for this book, she chose what I think is still a good way, right? I think it is still a satisfying way. I think it gets the job done and it wraps up the story nicely. For me personally, I would have done it differently, but that's not me saying that it should have been done differently, right? There are probably plenty of people that are like, this ending was awesome and it was perfect and I wouldn't have it any other way. Like I'm sure there are people out there, right? For me, I maybe would have liked something a little bit different, something a little bit more punchy, something with some more risks that might have had people going, oh, well, that sucked. I didn't want that to happen at all, which again, That's not even what I'm doing, right? I'm saying, yeah, it was still good. I would have liked some other things. And I think, generally speaking, that's okay. At the same time, seeing some risks with some endings is always exciting because it shows that the author is like, they want to have that level up, right? They want to take the risk to get that level up moment. But again, at the end of the day, it was still told well. It was still good. And part of the reason, again, is because the characters in the world are so strong. Naturally, your plot is going to be pretty sweet when you have such good characters and such good world building. Overall, the story is an 8 out of 10. I'm not quite sure that the ending lived up to the hype and the rest of the build-up of the narrative, but I can't dock it points all the way down to like a 3 or a 4 just because I was like, the ending was decent. Now time for the overall rating. Part of me is glad that this review took like 3 weeks longer than I had originally intended it to be for a plethora of reasons, but I also think I was still battling on whether or not to pick between a 9 and a 10 for this book. Because at the end of the day, I stayed up until 3 a.m. reading this to finish it, right? It's got to be pretty darn good if I'm going to do that, especially considering I'm a lot more tired than I was back when I was 13, 14, 15, and doing that like twice a week. I can't do that anymore. It's part of the reason why I got sick and couldn't get this review video out. But I feel like it would be a disservice to some of the other books that I truly think are absolutely perfect, that I have no notes on, right? To give this thing a 10, right? That said, The Priory of the Orange Tree is a beautiful story. It is, while the ending did bring me down a little bit, it was still, once again, I cannot stress this enough, a phenomenal story and a must read for really, I think, any fan of fantasy or high fantasy or perspective fantasy author. The book really is great. It is phenomenal. And again, while the ending may feel like, well, maybe the return on investment was not quite as high as you were expecting, it is an absolute blast from the start up until about 95% of the way, and then it just lets you down nice and easy. I say let down, let down was the wrong word there. It just takes you off nice and easy, exactly the way that you would likely expect, right? A very solid book overall, quite simply phenomenal, right? I give Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon a 9 out of 10.